I'm Daphne Lemish. I'm the Associate Dean for the School of Communication Information, and it is my delight and honor to introduce you to the three intellectuals, real powerhouse that we have here sitting in front of us. I can spend the entire 9 minutes we have together just introducing them to you, but I don't think this is what you want, so I want some brief comments, which is read quickly just to make sure that we got that covered. So, our guest of honor is Sarah Banet-Weiser, who is professor and head of the Media and Communications Department at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's the author, among other accomplishments, of The Most Beautiful Girl in the World, Beauty Pageants and National Identity, Kids Rule, Nickelodeon and Consumer Citizenship, Authentic, the Politics of Ambivalence in a Brand Culture, and the recent Empowered Popular Feminism and Popular Misogyny, which she's going to be speaking about today. She's also the co-editor of Cable Visions, Television Beyond Broadcasting, Commodity Activism, Cultural Resistance in Neoliberal Times, and the forthcoming Racism Post-Race. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She's the author of the award-winning books From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, which is an examination of the history and politics of Black America and the development of the social movement Black Lives Matter in response to police violence in the United States. Also, she's the author of How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Kamahi River Collective. Her forthcoming book is titled Race for Profit, Black Home Ownership and the Urban Crisis. And then finally, our own Gloria Steinem, in undergrad chair in Media Culture and Feminist Studies, Naomi Klein, a journalist, author, and activist, a public intellectual whose best-selling explorations of social, economic, and ecological injustice have made her a global thought leader. She's the author of The Battle for Paradise, Puerto Rico Takes on the Disaster Capitalist, No is Not Enough, Capitalism versus the Climate, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, and No Logo, celebrating 20 years since its first publication and still making waves. Her work has been translated into more than 30 languages and won many awards. You may have recently seen the creative video she produced with her partner, Abby Lewis, right here. He hopefully will get here. We're going to point out to him. Here he is. How do you know? Great entry. You have seats right here.
Thanks.
I was just saying, Abby Lewis. And Michelle Lewis, welcome. Good having you here with us.
I was just waiting.
Yeah, you're waiting for us to call your name, right? So, as I was saying, you may recently have seen, and if you haven't, check it online, a message from the future that she produced together with Abby Lewis, her partner, narrated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez about the Green New Deal. Very importantly, she's a teacher here at the Department of Journalism and Media Studies and the Department of Women and Gender Studies. And since arriving at Rutgers last summer, she's already made a significant contribution to broadening the discourse on our campus about gender in relationship to the structural issues of the big questions of our times, all forms of inequalities, and of course, climate change. All three of our participants are also public intellectuals. They write and appear in a host of public media, including the most prestigious one. I can hardly wait to see the fireworks that will come out of the encounter of the three of them together. So let's give them all a hand. And we're going to start by Sarah Banet-Weiser talking about her new book. Actually, a very brave book under the circumstances of our times, Empowered Popular Feminism and Popular Misogyny, which is so timely given the cultural dead scope of popular feminism. Let me read a quote from the book covered by Rosen Gill, professor of social and cultural analysis at City University of London. Quote, "This is a brilliant, incisive, and compelling read that helps us to think together to seemingly contrary trends. The current power of popular feminism alongside the chilling rise of vicious misogyny." Sarah Banet-Weiser will open our event with the presentation of the book, and then she'll be joined for a conversation with our two other distinguished guests. So thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It is such an incredible privilege to be in conversation with Keeanga and Naomi. I'm not exactly sure what the fireworks will be, but I'm sure it will be a lively conversation, and I'm just really honored to be invited, so thank you for having me. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about kind of the broader trajectory of Empowered and what I started out writing, what I ended up writing, which were two different things, as they often are. And just, I'm going to show a couple of slides just because so you can see the visuals here, and we'll just talk for a little bit before we get going. But I don't know how to, I guess that is how. Let me just. Okay, so I started out writing a book on popular feminism. I am a feminist media scholar. I've been teaching gender and media for 20 years, my entire career. And one of the things that I noticed that was so exhilarating and bolstering to me in the last decade was in my classes, like gender and media, I saw this trajectory of students who really recoiled from being identified with any kind of feminism at all, to, taking the class only because it was like a required diversity class, really, to this incredibly active and activist group of students who were forming feminist activist groups on campus, who were deeply and painfully aware of rape culture on college campuses and agitating for better and safer campuses, who were gathering up and writing about media representations of gender and being critical of them. And I saw this trajectory, and it was really, really bolstering. This is in the last kind of 10 years. At the same time, it seemed like on every media platform you could find, there was a new expression or practice of feminism. From pins that you wear on your lapel, to t-shirts, to corporate campaigns, to marches. And so I started thinking about what the conjuncture of events was that kind of was occurring that allowed for this emergence and authorized this emergence of a particularly visible kind of feminism. So I thought about it in terms of the popular, because for me, and in the book I talk about a sort of three-pronged definition of what popular means. So for me, the popular and popular feminism means broad accessibility across multiple media platforms, right? So you see these messages and expressions of feminism in not just broadcast television, but also film and popular music, and kind of most urgently and ubiquitously across social media and digital media platforms. So the popular was this broad accessibility. It was also, the popular for me was also about a kind of just a basic definition of popularity. That there were some groups that were kind of like-minded groups that attracted other like-minded groups and formed a popular kind of community. In just like, for some people in high school, if it was the kind of hideous event that it was for me, there were popular groups, and then there were not so popular groups, right? And the thing about those groups, high school cliques, is that popular groups have a heightened visibility. The spotlight on those groups tends to eclipse others around them and exclude other groups. So I was interested in that kind of inclusion and exclusion of different versions of feminism. And finally, I have been kind of mobilized and inspired my entire career by the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, who famously argued long ago that the popular is a terrain of struggle with competing demands of power and dominance. And so I saw these different versions of feminism circulating across multimedia platforms, and wanted to think about which versions became the most visible and why was that. So that's kind of, I started looking at popular feminism in the media and thought about how it was that feminism itself has materialized as a kind of media. So that's how I started off. This is Merriam-Webster's 2017 chose feminism as their word of the year. Does anyone know how Merriam-Webster chooses their words of the year? By any chance? Numbers of clicks, right? So how many times was this word clicked? Which is really great. It was clicked a lot of times, but also we don't know why it was clicked, for what reasons it was then used, the word feminism. So thinking about those kinds of things led me to other media platforms. So So for me, popular feminism, that the version that becomes the most visible is often a kind of corporate capitalist, corporate feminism that is also based in a capitalist framework. You have basic commodities like the H&M Empower Women crop top that you can get for 20 pounds in London, to the Christian Dior's 2017 line, the white t-shirt, we should all be feminists, which you can get for $710. So only some people really can be feminists and wear that shirt. To you know, other more edgy feminist AF t-shirts, to celebrity feminists like Taylor Swift or Emma Watson, to a coding industry, a movement to teach girls and women to code so that they can enter the technology industries, which becomes a whole new industry in and of itself, to marches, to perhaps the quintessential popular feminist corporation, Dove, in their campaign for real beauty, to online. The blogosphere is filled with, you know, blogs and articles about feminism, popular feminism, anti-racism, and those sort of things. And some of them are much more critical about structure than others. Other ones, Everyday Feminist. Feminism is a website where you can take courses online in order to become a better feminist, like in order to build your online feminist hustle. I actually couldn't bear to figure out what the hell that meant. So I did not take that one, but I did take the self-love course, which I had to take this course, which I paid $100 for, and then I went and I just would list. You had to go through these exercises like behavioral cognitive therapy, like list all the things that made you feel crappy today. And then you kind of work through them in your mind and online. And I took all the different exercises, and now I have a certificate in self-love. So, very happy about that. Whenever I feel bad, just bring it out of my wallet. So this is what I was realizing here was that the architecture of many of these popular media platforms is capitalist and corporate. So that means that the social and economic conditions of these platforms, that number of clicks that you need to have feminism be decided as the word of the year, the number of likes and followers, in the kind of the way in which it has a presence in an attention economy, right, is already built on a kind of capitalist logic, right? An accumulation of numbers where a business model can't help but constrain and condition the kinds of feminism that become the most visible. And again, it should be clear here that I'm not talking, this is not the only sort of feminism. It is the one that becomes so visible in part because it addresses us as individuals rather than addresses a collective intersectional politics. Much harder to tweet in 140 characters what collectivity means or intersectionality means. And so this is the kind of version that you see over and over again. So I kind of started out to write about this. And I am bolstered by this. I feel ambivalent about it. I'm critiquing it because of the way in which it targets women in particular as individuals, as consumers. I'm critiquing the capitalist logics on which it circulates. But I also think, it's something. It's something that that my students are wearing feminist AF shirts. So it's not so much about the political intentions of individuals or collectives, but rather again about how feminism materializes as a kind of media. And my argument here is that it circulates in terms of its visibility, but often visibility becomes an end in itself. And it doesn't go to another level or another step to kind of form a collective, so it just continues to circulate. So you wear the t-shirt, and the t-shirt itself becomes the politics. It's the kind of radical announcement of who you are, and so that's what I was kind of critiquing. And again, this is not to critique anyone who wears this t-shirt, because I have a lot of these t-shirts. I have a lot, I realized kind of ironically, I didn't mean to be ironic because I'm not that clever, but I have like notebooks, feminist notebooks, and all sorts of things that I use. So it's not so much about the commodities themselves as it is about how visibility becomes an end in itself. So while I was looking into this, it became very clear very quickly that regardless of what expression of feminism I was looking at, there was always, and I mean always, a hostile and vicious misogynist rejoinder. For every Tumblr page that was about body positivity, there were slut-shaming comments or fat-shaming comments. For every girls' organization about confidence, there was online harassment about how women's confidence takes confidence away from men. And I began to think of this as a kind of responsive relationship. Anytime feminism is in the air, there's misogyny, there's a misogynistic response. But I do think that we're in a heightened moment, in part because of the conjuncture, because of the kind of presence of social media, where misogyny itself is also heightened. And it engages in this, kind of relationship with popular feminism. So I started to think about how those same forms of popularity of popular feminism, popularity, media access, broad accessibility, and kind of a terrain of struggle, how it also fuels and heightens the visibility of misogyny in increasing ways. And these are just a few examples. There's chat rooms and on Reddit and blogs, and also they have t-shirts. I just put Jordan Peterson up here, just to put Jordan Peterson up here, because he is now building a career lamenting the fate of the young white male in North America. We have incels, this is Elliot Rodger, who killed 6 people in Santa Barbara. This is Anita Sarkeesian, who is she's a feminist YouTube blogger who had a series about video games and was kind of one of the impetuses for what's been called Gamergate. She dared to enter into a critique of the representation of women on video games, and this is just some gamer made a game called Beat Up Anita Sarkeesian, where all you have to do is push the space bar and her face becomes, bloody. So I was, at that time, still somewhat stunned at the vitriol and viciousness of misogyny, and was trying to think about what it means. So, and I don't want to take up too much time because I wanted to have the conversation, but one of the things I started thinking about is how there's a discourse of injury that happens here, and we were talking about this a little bit beforehand, where misogyny is reacting to this kind of heightened visibility, where women are saying, I'm more confident, I have, my self-esteem is higher, I have my certificate in self-love, right? And it's kind of framed as a zero-sum game. If I'm confident, it means I'm taking away confidence from men. If I take that job at Google, then it means I'm taking away that industry from men, in this particular kind of form. Of course, I don't think I need to say it, but I will anyway. This is not all men are misogynist. And also, it's very clear that there are plenty of women who are misogynists, right? That this is not something that is a body issue in that sense. So I developed this kind of analytic of injury throughout the book to talk about how the themes of popular feminism, confidence, competence, self-esteem, were appropriated and taken up by popular misogyny and turned on their head, where the politics were distorted, where the real victims became men and the perpetrators became women, right? And so I talk about this as like a funhouse mirror, that there's a mirroring of themes, but the mirroring is, again, distorted. The politics are distorted and transmuted into a totally different social arrangement. So this is, kind of the way in which masculinity is seen to be threatened by this injury is by feminism. It's a way in which masculinity is threatened by by feminism and women in general. These are just a few tweets. Did people see the Gillette ad? Okay, so this, if you haven't seen it, was a Gillette, the razor ad that uses the word toxic masculinity and features Me Too in it. And basically, the message of the ad is not complex. It's like, be a decent human, right? I mean, that's like, it doesn't even say buy our razor and be a decent human. It's just be kind, be a decent human. The reaction was swift, it was vicious, and it was because this ad dared to use the words toxic masculinity and say, we need to be better. And so these are just some of the ways to show you how this reaction is so quick and so vicious, including Piers Morgan, who's like my new BFF since I moved to London. He's a big feminist, follower, who says, let boys be damn boys, let men be damn men. There's this idea somehow that feminism is threatening masculinity and threatening patriarchy, and so the move is to restore it. So quickly, just show you two different examples of this funhouse mirror so that you can see what I'm talking about. This is a campaign, Canadian campaign, that was built on a coalition of anti-rape advocates for women on college campuses. And they created a campaign that was called Don't Be That Guy, where they put up in bars and in bathrooms and in campuses in Vancouver and Toronto, and said things like, just because she's drinking doesn't mean she wants sex. Sex without consent equals sexual assault. Okay, so don't be that guy. Almost immediately, a men's rights organization in Canada created a mirrored campaign called Don't Be That Girl, literally using the same images, right? Taking the image from the campaign, saying just because you regret a one-night stand doesn't mean it wasn't consensual. Just because she's easy doesn't mean you shouldn't fear false criminal accusations. One of the logics of men's rights, of some men's rights organization, is that rape culture is something made up by feminists, right? That men are being falsely accused of rape, and this was part of that campaign. So you can see here this kind of mirroring of themes, an appropriation of these themes as a way to then create men as the victims of feminism rather than talk about structural misogyny. And finally, the last example I will give is Me Too, because Me Too is something that I also feel quite bolstered by and quite ambivalent about. Me Too, hashtag Me Too, the hashtag Me Too started with this story here about Harvey Weinstein, which was in the New York Times, October 17th, 2017. And its students caused this avalanche of stories that we heard about sexual harassment across all industries. I'm ambivalent about it, in part because African-American activist Tarana Burke, as many of us know, began the Me Too movement 10 years before this, 2007, that is meant to be an intersectional feminist community to help survivors of sexual assault and rape, especially Black women and women of color. And so this Tarana Burke was largely eclipsed at the beginning of the Me Too movement, and instead it became a movement that became visible because of the use of mainly white celebrities. So it's visible in that way, but it also eclipses other sorts of feminisms and other sorts of intersectional politics. At that time it was like every single day there was a new story about Me Too. And it felt like an avalanche. Almost a year exactly after the Harvey Weinstein story aired, another sort of story starts circulating. Sorry to have the Kavanaugh picture up. I should have issued a trigger warning. This is the story about Trump says it's a very scary time for young men in America. In one short year, on the exact same media platforms that the Me Too story circulated, you get a different kind of story where victimhood is reallocated to men in incredible positions of power and disarticulated from women who had suffered from rape and sexual harassment. So again, this kind of mirroring of themes and mirroring of logics is, you know, the core of this relationship that I talk about as popular feminism and popular misogyny. So I'm not going to leave that up. I'll just leave that up, or I'll put the other one up. It's much better. And yeah, so thanks.
Right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, Sarah. That was wonderful, challenging, and I, when we had this opportunity for you to come to Rutgers, and I was thinking of the type of event you could do, I immediately thought of Keeanga's work as being somebody who has also been thinking very deeply around this tension of these movements that spread so quickly, and this sort of that ambivalence that you're describing, but also trying to wrestle with how do you actually build social movements that win. And Keeanga has written about the Women's March in this context, about the BlackLivesMatter in this context, and you know, even dared to write a somewhat critical review of Michelle Obama's book in Boston Review. And so I just thought it would be wonderful for the two of you to be in conversation, and Keeanga brought some questions. So I'm gonna throw it to Keeanga first. Just before we start, I just want to say, I just want to just take this opportunity, because we're all in a room together, to thank and congratulate the bargaining team of the our union here. We have Adiba and David, and I think Sherry in the room. So let's call them a big hand. Thank you for your work, which is really relevant to the conversation we're having, because one of the things that's really special about our union is that they did put pay equity and faculty diversity on the bargaining table, and that's really, really rare. So it certainly relates to this question of how do we bridge from representation to maybe some power.
Hey, hello everyone. So one of this book is fantastic. It's very great to read, and it resonated with one of the questions that I was wrestling with in my Black Lives Matter book, which had to do with the role of social media and social movements. Because I think early on, with Black Lives Matter, there was the idea that social media had become liberating, that African Americans no longer had to wait for the mainstream media to become interested in a particular story in order to carry it, but that there was a way in which individuals could champion cases and bring attention to cases. And so you talk some about this in the context of the new popular feminism, in terms of drawing a distinction between visibility as a means of bringing attention to a particular issue, publicizing an issue that might otherwise not be discussed, but that there's something that happens with this popular feminism, in particular, where visibility becomes a means unto itself, and I think that there are definite parallels in Black Lives Matter, and so I'm wondering if you could talk some about what is social media introducing into this dynamic? Because it's also the case that some of the tensions around the emergence of feminism and misogyny, so the dynamic that exists between the two, is obviously not new. And even some of the tropes of confidence and self-esteem, this was a major part of ad campaigns in the 1970s, right? The Calgon, the more cigarettes, this idea that women could be as powerful, aesthetically at least, as men, which also kind of conjures a backlash. And so I wonder if you could say something about what is different. How does social media transform these, in some ways, older dynamics, but introduces new issues into them?
Yeah, can you hear me? Is this on? Is on?
No, just finish.
Now? Yes. Thank you for that. It's a great and complicated question. So a couple of things. Because I don't, like you just said, there's, misogyny has existed for centuries. Every time that any kind of organized movement that then identifies itself as feminist, there's been a backlash. What I do think is different in this particular moment, so that's still true. Mm-hmm. But I do think what's different is that a backlash does imply a kind of linear backlash. You lash back at something with the kind of global social media and digital media network that exists for, as the center of so much of our communication in the current moment. It lashes out in all directions, and it's networked in a different sort of way. So men's rights organizations have been around since the 70s, and in the 70s they were also kind of the men's rights organizations that were bigger didn't necessarily have a violent edge to them. It was about actually becoming better men, right? In a sort of way, and even if it was kind of Robert Bly beating drums in the woods, but also like the Promise Keepers, which is a Christian men's rights organization that was about, but it was about a kind of internal process, right? With social media, men's rights organizations have exponentially grown all over the world, and there's still a continuum of them. But there is much more opportunity to be violent and vicious in these, where they call for the rape of women, where they call, where it's vicious racism and misogyny directed at women. Part of that is because of the reach of social media, because they can actually reach, that accessibility. So it's networked in that kind of way. It's not just social media though. It's also networked in ways that, there are boot camps and seduction communities and websites and global meetups and, where men gather to kind of talk about this stuff. And I think that the enclosures of misogyny, where misogyny was still seen to be something that you don't do necessarily in public. Remember, Trump's locker room, right? Those enclosures, I think, have opened up in a moment. So it's not that the technology of social media caused this, but it does amplify it, and then that amplifies it. It kind of authorizes misogyny to kind of manifest in other spaces. So I think that it is different in that way. But I also think, and then I'll be quiet, but I also think that Black Lives Matter is a really, really interesting case, because when the videos of police shooting young black men started circulating because people were taking videos on their phone, and like you said, for the first time there was an attention paid to this because you didn't have to go through gatekeeping at, in mainstream media. When those circulated, I felt, okay, social media can be liberating in this way, right? And then, right? Case after case after case found the police not guilty with what seemed to be this kind of visible evidence in front of all of us, right? And so that really made me think also about this idea that visibility just becomes an end in itself, and when you try to actually, impact something through policy or law, it doesn't exceed its visibility. Not to mention that it's traumatizing to relive those videos and see those videos over and over again, just like traumatizing for women who come forward on Twitter with Me Too, to relive their stories in order to be believed finally, you know, and then Kavanaugh is confirmed, right? And so it's, I'm not hope. I have hope. I mean, I'm not hope. It's not hopelessness. Yes, I'm not full of it. That's right. I'm not full of hope, but I do have some hope. But yeah, I'm hopish. That's what I'm hopish.
That's so. Has it social media then fundamentally transformed our relationships to these issues? Because one of the things about visibility and the example that you just used, the funeral of Emmett Till, right, is a very powerful example of how, you know, his mother decided to have an open casket funeral. Jet magazine takes a picture of Emmett Till's corpse, and this becomes, you know, one of many, but a significant catalyzing moment for the civil rights movement. And I think, to some extent, there was the idea, you think about 2009 and the murder of Oscar Grant, that really is one of the first cases within the era of BlackLivesMatter that is captured, you know, in real time and then heavily circulated. That there was a sense in which the visualization of these acts of brutality could compel the state to act, which for a brief moment, Obama was uniquely pressured to do so. But I do think that now, I mean, these things circulate on a regular basis, and not only does it have very little resonance in the society at large, but even among people who would identify themselves as Black Lives Matter activists, it has, you know, it has almost no reverberation anymore. And so it does raise a question as to whether the social media, how has it transformed our relationships to these images, to being shocked, to such an extent? Can we go back? Can we go back to being shocked?
I hope so. I want to say that sometimes I'm still shocked, and I'm always sort of happy in that moment, because it feels like I'm not completely numb to some of this. But it is true that, the capitalist logic of social media is about numbers. And it's, like I said earlier, it's about the accumulation of numbers. It's about liking and retweeting and following and then moving on. And so you like, and I always find it really difficult to like something that is disturbing, because I think, because I think that needs to have visibility, but the only option we have is a heart, and it's like that seems like very odd to me that I'm just hearting something, that is really messed up, But so I think that there's a limited kind of logic to social media, that is, so much of it is about circulation, and there's so much of it. This is what, people, talk about in terms of how much information we get. So I think that, in answer to your question, can we go back? I don't think we're going back, actually, I don't. But I don't think that it's all there is. And I think that there can be other ways to use the mobilizing power of social media, but in a way that is actually committed to collectivities rather than individuals. It's just about us, it's just about individuals of social media. It's I like it, I follow,
And you are alone.
Yeah.
Looking at your screen, like just the structure of it is fundamentally disempowering.
Exactly.
You're not, it's not people in the streets in Ferguson together experiencing inaction, and I think the extent to which we're all spending our lives on a screen, what this is doing to our attention span, the sort of deadening impact of just the Trump shock machine, right?
Yeah.
It's all, I think, contributing to that.
Yeah.
And also, I think I think people become disempowered when they don't see a path to political change, right? So if the original theory of change was, we're going to look at this video, we're going to look at these images, we're going to share our stories, and we are all, and that is going to lead to change. And then it's like, wait a minute, we Me Too'd up the wazoo. We showed the most shocking images we've ever seen, and we took to the streets, and then what, right? And so I think part of it is, and this is something Keeanga's written about, and this is a really strong theme in your work as well, Sarah, is just the whole where that sort of democratic collective decision making, where you come up with your next step, right? You don't come up with your next step in a 140-word tweet, staring at the screen. But I want to come back to this question around, what is happening with this movements in the online space and digital space, because one of the tensions I see, and I'd love to hear you speak more about this, around the visibility question, and this also plays into what you were saying around the hyper-personalization of your own empowerment, of your own confidence. Like, it's not a collective struggle, it's your individual struggle, is where this all fits in with sort of personal branding, right? And this sort of incredibly precarious economy. And, feminism is now part of people's personal brands. Like, I was laughing, when you were saying you can't talk about intersectional feminism in a tweet, but actually, it's in a lot of people's Twitter bios, right? And, but I mean, that's great on one level, but like it's like comes back to what Bell Hooks said about why she didn't like to say I am a feminist. She said, I practice feminism. Feminism is something I do, it isn't something that I am. I can't just declare myself a feminist without saying I'm part of a project of liberation from domination. So, I mean, this relates to your previous book, Authentic, and one of the things that I've really been thinking a lot about since taking this position here, and being a professional feminist, is that the feminism that I grew up with was very much a critique of the objectification of women, right? And the process of personal branding and that is happening online relentlessly, and that now feminism is a prop of, is about self-object. Like, I mean, being a brand is turning yourself into an object, right? So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, so I wrote about self-branding in this book, Authentic, that Naomi's referencing, inspired, by the way, by Naomi's own logo, which is an amazing book, about the kind of what brand culture does in terms of kind of emptying out politics in particular ways. And I do think that once you start thinking about yourself as an object, you start putting yourself on a kind of a context of exchange, and it's about profit, and it's about how you exchange, commercial exchange. And that can't really go further than understanding oneself as an individual. And this is part of the kind of context of neoliberalism. We are, encouraged, if not mandated, to consider ourselves not as part of a collective, but as individuals, and create our self-brands. My students used to come and talk to me about career advice, undergraduates, and increasingly over the last decade or 15 years, they come and talk to me about how to build a self-brand, because that is the way in which they are being kind of exchanged in a commercial job market, in a precarious commercial job market. So I think that when feminism becomes a brand, the logic of that feminism is conditioned by capitalist logic, and it can only go so far. So I think that there's something that's great about harnessing feminist rhetoric for corporate campaigns. But if the goal of those corporate campaigns is not to challenge patriarchy, right? The goal of those corporate campaigns is not to challenge capitalism and the way that there's a gender division of labor that is built into the logic of capitalism. The goal of it is to build their own reputation as a woke company or whatever, because they're feminist. And so I think that, where we go from here is we use that visibility, right? We can use that visibility because the corporate campaigns aren't going to go away on social media. We use that visibility, but then again, we take it somewhere else. We don't have visibility, like you had said before, as a means, as an end in and of itself. We actually create, use visibility as a route to politics. And you can see that. You can see that in Black Lives Matter, which starts in some ways as a social media movement, and has manifestations and spaces well outside of social media. And you can see that and thinking about even Occupy, and the idea that the 99% is something that people know what that means in a way that they never have understood the kind of wealth gap and the wealth divide. And so it's not that it only stays as visibility, but I think visibility is complex, and we matter when we're visible. And so the issue is how to matter, but not let visibility be, the end of that mattering.
I want to talk about the scary side of this, and this is something my students are here from our class on the corporate self, and I think more and more of us are realizing that these same technologies, these same platforms that super powered movements from Black Lives Matter to I Don't Know More to Me Too are simultaneously superpowering their attackers. And a lot of that is built into the algorithms, right? I mean, this is what we're hearing from the people who built these platforms. Hate is the most engaging emotion in the engagement economy. And so if you want to drive engagement, get people mad, get people pissed off. And when we're sitting here on Twitter, I mean, aren't we mad most of the time? But I also wonder whether there's, and I do not know whether this is true at all, but that what you were describing, Sarah, around this sense that anytime women are empowered or people of color are empowered, that it is a zero-sum game and white people are losing and men are losing. I mean, this has always been true, and this is this historical, cyclical, experience, as we know. But is part of it is it also the precarity of our economic moment, right? Where people are just in this sort of state of panic constantly about losing. So anybody gaining anything is taking away from you, or is that letting it off too easy? I mean, I'm obviously not letting it off, but I'm trying to understand how this could be spreading as quickly as it's spreading.
Yeah, no, I don't. I think it's absolutely part of it. I think that this also addresses one of your earlier questions, Keeanga, that why, aside from social media and its reach, why has popular misogyny and this rhetoric of injury reached such a kind of heightened visibility at this particular moment? I think it has a great deal to do with the 2007-2008 global economic collapse. There are real injuries, economic injuries, that led to that kind of emerged from that collapse. I think the interesting and scary thing, though, is that when, say, the white working class in the United States became even more precarious economically after the global economic collapse, the vitriol wasn't necessarily towards capitalism or the banks or greed, right? It became towards immigrants and women and people of color who are taking these jobs, right? So again, that's where the zero-sum game kind of plays into it. So when I talk about injury, and I mean, Brett Kavanaugh is just a particular example of a man who's incredibly powerful, an incredibly powerful position of privilege, who claims victimhood in this moment that seems that is laughable, right? That also that's not the case for so many people who are precarious economically. There's a real injury there. The problem, though, then, is the vitriol is directed towards women and people of color rather than towards structure, rather than towards the administration or unfair job labor practices or and that kind of thing.
That's interesting, because when you said that, I thought about that part of what seems different over not just the last 10 years, but over the last 40 years is that, I mean, this is what dovetails with neoliberalism, is the way that this rhetoric takes place in a context where there is, in this country, a bipartisan assault on the social safety net. So even in the U.S., where there is a very, has been a very anemic social safety net, that particularly in the last 20 years, the idea that there is something like social welfare is in of itself the basis of an attack. It is to open yourself up to attack, to even suggest such a thing. So in the context of this crisis, you have a complete and total aversion to the notion of taxation, that rich people have a social responsibility to society, and in the same way that you have a complete political aversion to social welfare, that it leaves you very few targets to point to. And I think that both parties, although the Republicans have taken it clearly to a different level, have mastered the art of blaming individuals for the economic crises that they inevitably drive the economy towards. And so I think it's an interesting idea that makes sense, that there is something particular to this historical moment, that you get such economic precarity. At the same time here, there is so little moral, political, or social investment in any kind of collective response to it that seems to create the conditions for a particularly vitriolic response, whether it's in the comments, in media exchanges, or embodied in Donald Trump, which seems like the ultimate kind of vitriolic response to the idea of a collective or of a social.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. This idea of kind of social welfare being itself, if you say you're committed to any part of it, then you become the subject or the target of vitriol. I think has in part to do with this economic crisis and precarity. I'm working on a paper right now with Jack Braddock, who's up there, on the way in which neoliberalism fails to manage its failures, and the way in which the networks of care that have been in other historical moments provided by social welfare, you have to look elsewhere for them, and they're few and far between. And so it becomes the burden of like you said, of the individual. And if the individual can't get out of this economic precarity, then it is his or her fault. And I see that theme throughout a lot of the relationship between popular feminism and popular misogyny. If you let's say identify as a woman in this culture, and you go on social media and you go on all the Tumblrs and the Tumblr pages and Instagram that tell you just be confident, and if you look at yourself in the mirror every day and say, I am beautiful, I am confident, and then you're not confident, it's your problem, not the context that made you feel less confident in the first place, right? It's like somehow I wasn't able to convince myself enough, that I'm confident enough. And so it becomes the burden of the individual. And I think that you can see, that's an example that seems quite banal compared to like the increasing violence of incels, which is also this, I did everything right. I did everything right that they told me to do, and then I still cannot sleep with the women I want to sleep with, right? And so I still do not have the sex that I am owed, right? Which is what Elliot Rodger had said in his manifesto. And so then it becomes this act of violence to wipe out, to silence women into, And so I think that's also in part because we don't have networks of care, in a way that is supported by social welfare, so that when, neoliberalism fails, which it will for most people, right? It has for most people. There's nowhere to go.
Well, that's where we get the polarization, because all of that has happened, and then you get in 2016 or 2015, 13 million people vote for an open socialist, Bernie Sanders, and now it's not even, it's strangely not even news that he's leading the pack of Democratic candidates for the nomination of the Democratic Party. So it points to an intensity of polarization, political polarization, with the right on the one hand, but a growing rejection of the rejection of social welfare and the idea that the state has some responsibility for provision.
Do you want to share a little bit of your analysis of becoming? Because I think it's really relevant to this in terms of what the ideology is, because people don't think of that as a book with an ideology, and in your review you say it has one.
Yeah, no, everyone asks me, why did I read that book? It's like, well, Michelle Obama is apparently the most admired woman in the United States. Those are what the polls now say. And, so I was trying to figure out what the politics of the book were, because she says repeatedly throughout the book that she's not political, that she doesn't, have any real political thoughts or ideas about anything. And then you come to see that, in fact, her father was a committee person in the Democratic Party in Chicago, and that she often did house visits with him. She was very involved in Barack Obama's presidential campaign, obviously, but he ran for state office and was successful, and this was, she quit her job at a prestigious law firm in Chicago to go into city government in the city. So, she has very pronounced ideas about politics. But one of the things that I found interesting reading your book was the way that her outlook and political ethos fit so snugly with with your analysis of popular feminism, and that it's all about much of it is situated on her personal struggles to become confident, to strive, her own road to success, and then how she sees her political commitment to empowering girls in this country and abroad to use their own personal stories as a source of motivation for themselves and other girls like them, but that she directly rejects any sense of collectivity from her own understanding of how she propelled into this position, which is to say that there are very violent riots, uprisings, rebellions in the city of Chicago that force the local city government to actually build this particular magnet public school on the west side of the city that she is a beneficiary of, that puts her in a position to go to Princeton and then to go to Harvard. But it's seen in very individual terms about the particular makeup of her family, the particular way that her parents encouraged her, which of course feeds back into the idea that, if you have engaged parents, that this is, somehow the decisive factor in your own personal success. To the most extreme version of this is that she seems to applaud Nelson Mandela for not fighting apartheid, but for being a respected statesman, ignoring, he was in an organization, the African National Congress, that had as its central tenet the armed struggle against apartheid, and was therefore on the U.S.'s terrorism list for decades. And so this story of personal empowerment is one that she seems particularly motivated, not just in explaining her own circumstance, but as a solution to the constraints, travails that women, girls like her, experience in life. And so one of the questions that I had was, how do you see race functioning with your concept of popular feminism when you think about someone like Michelle Obama and Beyonce being probably the two most well-known, well-regarded women in the United States, and how there's obviously an overlap and relationship between this kind of violent misogyny and white supremacy. There's also the way in which social media has fueled the rise of what you're defining as popular misogyny is certainly a component of the rise of the alt-right. And so how is race functioning in these concepts that you're introducing?
Okay, so there's so much in that question. I'm just gonna, and so much of it is super interesting, so I'm gonna try to just answer parts of it. I will say that.
And then we're gonna open it up.
Okay.
We're all gonna get your turn.
Okay, I will say that one of the at the beginnings of me thinking about this book happened in a very personal way when I was sitting on the couch with my daughter, who was 13 at the time, watching the 2014 VMA Music Awards and having Beyonce there with the word feminist lit up behind her, and I was like, oh my God, oh my God. But then my daughter looked at me and she's like, Mom, Beyonce's talking about your work. And I was like, yes, yes she is, yes. I called Beyonce and told her to do that. So I am not going to say anything about Beyonce, okay. But in terms of, and I will get to your question about race in 1 second, I think that the thing about Michelle Obama that I think you just laid out brilliantly in that Boston Review piece, by the way, which is a wonderful review, is that she is exactly the kind of popular feminist, or someone who identifies as popular feminist that I'm talking about in the book for a number of reasons. One is that her life story that you lay out that she lays out in the book and then that you review it's about leaning in. It's about overcoming imposter syndrome. It is about what Sheryl Sandberg tells women in positions of power or privilege to those who have the privilege to lean in and not get fired. It's about that. It's about becoming a better economic subject more than it is about becoming a better feminist subject, right? It's about and so much of this popular feminism, it seems to revolve around teaching girls and young women how to compete. That's what the confidence thing is. It's about being confident at work so you can get ahead, right? So it's this kind of capitalist competition from the ground up. And so I think that Obama fits very well in this idea of becoming in her life trajectory. The other way I think that Michelle Obama fits in is that she is incredibly unalienating. I want her to be my best friend. Right. Regardless of the book, right? She's nice. She is loves her kids, she loves her husband, she's cheery, she's like the happy, cheery feminist, right? She doesn't alienate anyone in that sense. And so
Barack Obama calls her Joe Public.
Yes, exactly. And popular feminism, the kind that becomes the most visible, is not an alienating feminism. It's an accommodating one. It's not about and that's why it can't really challenge patriarchy or capitalism, because those are really alienating positions to be in, right? Because it's not, and so I think that she fits in that way, as a popular feminist as well. In terms of race, there's lots of ways in which race plays into this kind of version of popular feminism. Michelle Obama and Beyonce are two very powerful women who are still subjects of racism all the time. So, women, Black women, women of color within this landscape are not just hit with misogyny, but also hit with racism, misogynoir, and this way in which this is like this, that there's an attack on them because they are women of color and because they are women, in a way that is not new, right? It is not new. It also doesn't get the attention that this kind of popular feminism gets. When I think feminism begins to be embraced, widely in the United States and North America, really in Europe, is when there seemed to be a crisis in girls. And that crisis was about body image issues and cyberbullying and STEM, not going into STEM fields. It was a crisis that became a crisis because white middle-class girls were seen to be experiencing it. Where before, for long histories before, girls of color were experiencing crises of self-esteem and living in a racist society, right? So when white middle-class girls become the objects of crisis, a kind of a movement, or there's a kind of popular feminism that's authorized that says we need to, avow feminism and challenge gender inequality. And so I think that that this kind of popular feminism is what Mia McKenzie, who runs the Black Girl Dangerous blog, calls white feminism TM. Right, which is kind of a branding of a certain kind of non-alienating, happy, cheery feminism.
With the little fist.
Exactly. With the necklace, and that is about often about becoming a better economic subject, right? Enlightened, feminist, but also an economic subject in an economic landscape in which only some people have the privilege to become better economic subjects. So and that's also part of that kind of competing for dominance. And finally, the last thing I'll say is that this idea of empowerment, when Michelle Obama says she's empowering girls, my biggest question is always like, what are we empowering girls to do? Yes. I mean, what is it? It's like empowerment itself. It's like, I'm empowered. That's like they play, and like empowered to do what? I have to say, when I first sat down, I saw that hashtag, and I thought it said hashtag how empowered are you? I forgot that it was at Rutgers. Like, I forgot that it was RU stood for Rutgers. And I was like, really? They're asking how empowered are you as a tagline for this stuff? So anyway,
Very good.
Okay, so we're gonna open it up. Who's gonna be bringing mics around? How are we doing this? Do we need mics?
We have one here.
Oh, okay. So, if you don't mind coming out to the mic. While you're coming out, I think about Ilhan Omar as somebody who just brings it all together, right? All strikes against her at once, right? And you see actually just how fluid these, seemingly separate hate streams are. They just all come rushing for her.
Yeah.
Is this on? Oh, yeah. Okay. Hi. I'm a little bit intimidating. Should I maybe move back to my seat so I can pass it along? So also. Yeah? Yeah, sure.
That's an innovative approach. Pass it to the next person.
I guess I have, and a question. My comment first, listening to you guys, is, well, I mean, I think we probably all think about how we use social media and how social media plays in our lives, because, I mean, it's so, it's just so, it takes so much of our time. And so I'm thinking now that social media is actually a perfect tool for capitalism, because when I think of younger, I'm just 29, and so when I think of people who are 24, 25 and under, their use of social media is very different than mine, and so I don't understand how they use social media. I don't understand Snapchat and stuff like that. I can do Instagram, Facebook, but not Snapchat, for instance. And so I'm like thinking that all of these tools, there are new tools all the time and new things, and so I don't remember which theorist it was, but so it's like this absorption by capitalism of these tools, and so the usage of them is being renewed, and there are new things up there, updates, and new, I don't know, just new things. And so I feel like I don't understand how all of that works anymore. And so I'm thinking that, well, yeah, it's a great tool for capitalism, because then there's this feeling of being unrooted, or, yeah, of not having control over our surroundings. I guess that's my little epiphany that I have now.
Thanks.
And then the question that I had was to Sarah Banet-Weiser about all those comments. I'm wondering, don't you think that for a lot of people also using social media or these comments, maybe a lot of people don't necessarily believe what they comment, but that it's just, this amplification, and it pushes a lot of people towards being extremely violent. So don't you think that there's a sort of distortion of what people maybe actually think, or some of them at least?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that also, like, comments, I was reading an article in Slate just today about the hashtag Your Slip is Showing, which was a hashtag that was created by two African-American women after they realized that there was a trolling campaign that targeted Black women in ways that pretended to be the allies of Black women, right? And so your slip is showing is like, oh, we see what you're doing, right? That kind of move. So for one thing, we don't know how to believe what we're reading in this moment. We don't know. There's no question of authenticity in social media. We don't know if something has been generated and amplified by bots, by trolls, so that is part of that. So yeah, we don't believe that. And then there's this kind of numbness, that because, like you said, especially younger generation are so used to horrible statements, about their bodies and about their desirability, about everything, about that there's this kind of numbness, and like you said, maybe we don't believe them. I don't think, though, that we should just stay in that moment, right? I think that you can have, a group of 18-year-old young women who read, rape threats and comments about their bodies and about being desirable over and over again, and they can laugh and they can say, hater's gonna hate or whatever. I know that's very old. Sorry, so now, no one even says that anymore. So, but just imagine whatever they're saying now, that same sentiment. It cannot but affect them in some way. It cannot, the avalanche of these comments, just the sheer vastness of them, of this kind of harassment, has to affect us in some way. And you can see it in terms of dropping self-esteem and confidence issues and that kind of thing. So I don't have an answer to that, except for that I don't think that we should dismiss them as meaningless.
Thank you.
We've got over there, just over there.
Or she also is?
Oh, okay. Well, we'll just stay right there. You sure? You sure?
All right. Well, thank you. I have a question about Me Too, something you raised early on. I wonder, just as a question of political strategy, how do you see the potential and the limits of the victim position, or the identity of being a survivor? Is there a limit to how far that can take a movement, or how long it can take a movement, if one bases so much of a claim on victimhood?
It's a great question. It's kind of what I'm working on now as a kind of post project right now. It depends on how you're defining victimhood. I think how we define victimhood. I think that the most common way that victimhood is used in things like Me Too or in sexual harassment cases or in rape cases is based on a kind of liberal notion of autonomy, right? So it's you're either a victim or you're an agent, and what kind of one of the line or the narratives of kind of neoliberal resilience is that to be a survivor is to get over your victimhood, right? To get over that. And so I don't actually find that helps us politically to kind of rely on those liberal categories of autonomy and selfhood, because I think that it then does, other people have said this too, but it does put the focus of Me Too more on the me than it does on the too. And so because it's an individualist move. So I'm trying to, and I don't really have an answer to you, but I'm trying to think through how it is that we could think about vulnerability instead of victimhood, and to kind of mobilize vulnerability not as something that is diametrically opposed to resistance, but rather can be marshaled as an act of resistance in itself that doesn't. That relies on community rather than the individual.
Chandra, David, can you bring it to Chandra over here? And then the next undergrad who puts their hand up gets the mic.
Thank you for all this great conversation. I'm wondering how you all are thinking through, I'm thinking of some contemporary feminist figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but also someone like Greta Thunberg, who both of whom have centered like ecology as a big part of their politics, also represent all these problems of visibility and are hyper-circulated, but are seen to be really trying to push against an individualist narrative around themselves. But also I'm not sure, like, to what extent are they escaping it? So for me, I just will come out and say I'm really compelled by them, inspired by them, but I wonder how you all are thinking through their examples.
I mean, I have to ask it to you.
You just did the film?
Yeah.
Look, I think that both of them are tremendously inspiring figures, and basically, not to overstate it, but fate of the world wrestlers. But I think that there is a difference when you are using social media, and both of them use the hell out of social media, very skillfully in different ways. And in the case of Greta, as a 16-year-old, just extraordinary what she's doing. And not just social media, but what she's doing with her speeches. I don't know if you saw the one she gave to British Parliament where she kept saying, "Is my mic working? Do you hear me? Because you're not acting
How's
like
my
me."
English?
But I think that this question that Keeanga was talking about is the visibility a tool? Is it a means to an end, or is it the end? And I think in both of those cases, it's very clearly a tool, because their political project is transparent, their theory of change is pretty clear as well. Greta is mainly tweeting saying, "Come join my school strike. We're gonna get all the kids in the entire world to go on strike and stop going to school until the adults solve climate change." And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has a political platform that she was elected on and that she's trying to enact, and she has a theory of change about influencing the 2020 elections. So That said, I still think there are dangers with just the power of celebrity in our culture. You know, and I hope dearly that they both manage to navigate this and come out of it. I can say that it terrifies me as somebody who has experienced the barest amount of what both of them have experienced, and particularly Alexandria, but also Ilan Omar, and the relentlessness of it, you know, and I worry about people's immune systems being under siege. Like, just human bodies are not built to be under siege 24 hours a day like that. And even if you think about historical precedents, like, you know, sure, like civil rights leaders in the past had powerful enemies that killed them, but they didn't have access to them 24/7 in their brains in the way that these people who make these decisions to be porous and actually read their mentions, you know, are opening themselves up to. And so I just hope that they are surrounded by people who are just loving them and taking care of them, and that we also give ourselves grace. I mean, you said, what did you say? It takes your time. You give it your time. We do have the power to not be online all the time, to use controls, and you know, it takes effort, but it is possible to do, and we really have to. Anybody else want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is, I do think that these are examples, and there are other examples that I think are important to mention, that use social media as a means of mobilization. I think that, and I think it's important to say that because these kinds of discussions can very quickly become morose, that, you know, social media is all powerful, that we're slaves to it, and that, you know, what can we do? There's nothing that we can do. When there are clear examples of things that we can do, I think one of the more successful kind of mass actions over the last year and a half has been the wave of teacher strikes that began in West Virginia and have taken off clearly, you know, from coast to coast, and continue to be to unfold, and have become a very important example that mass mobilization and political action on a collective basis continues to get the goods, and that serves as an important example, even as a counterweight to just the idea that we just need to get rid of Trump and not actually deal with the longer tentacles of Trumpism that, you know, pervade our political system and are not embodied in a single individual. And that we have to think about what that means beyond just elections. Even though I think the election is important, it's not the only, you know, it's not the only tool. And Bernie Sanders could become president tomorrow, and without a mass movement that is ready to actually fight for a political agenda, it won't mean much. And so I think that in that context, it's important to look at examples within this country, but also outside of the United States as well, to see the power of mass mobilizations. I will say that I think the threat of celebrity culture that I think is also particular to this era of social media is real, and it's damaging. And it's not, you know, it's not as if people set out to become social media celebrities within an activist context, but it is the way that the kind of nonstop engagement, attention, and solicitation from the media, from other people, from the platform that is created by social media can create that. And can create a kind of whirlwind effect that also has a distorting impact on what those individuals actually represent, and you know, what their impact is. And so that's another danger that exists that, you know, I think is why the need for organization and democracy within movements is so critical to mitigating against that, and that people who are in social movements actually be connected to something other than their social media platforms as a way to cut against that.
Let's see some hands, some students.
So when you think about like critiquing like Beyonce and Michelle Obama, like these people are like obviously like very visible figures, and like when you think about like respectability politics and like they uphold this like certain like popular feminism, but like social media moves like really fast. So if these figures were to like present a feminism that like wasn't pop feminism, their platform would sort of like, it seems like, just be like taken away. So I'm wondering like if you have like any comments about like how you maintain a platform and like push a feminism that, or any movement that like does critique like patriarchy and capitalism while maintaining that platform, if that makes sense.
That is very.
That is the question.
That is the question. Yes. Yes. Thank you for asking it. I think that I think that actually relates to the question we just talked about in terms of figures like Greta and Michelle Obama and Beyonce. It is about recognizing the power of social media, harnessing the power of social media, mobilizing it to help facilitate or organize a mass movement, but not having it be the mass movement. And I think that that's, so Greta was part of the Extinction Rebellion. So she just went. They shut down the streets in central London. I live in central London. I mean, that's amazing, to shut down the streets in a major cosmopolitan city that I'm sure was coordinated in many ways over social media, over tweets and those kinds of things. But to, I think what happened was that power of social media to connect people kind of several years ago in the second Arab Spring or in Iceland, or it became easier to just assume that that's the movement itself, right? The movement itself has to be inconvenient, right? It has to be teachers walking out on classrooms so their kids cannot be taught. It has to be cities being shut down by protesters so that people can't get to work, right? It has, and I think that social media allows for an ease of politics that isn't inconvenient, and politics are really have to be inconvenient if something is going to shift, I think.
We're out of time. We have one last question over there.
Can we just make an announcement before you ask the question?
Sorry, we work for Rutgers for the Office of Violence Prevention and Victim Assistance, and we just wanted everyone to know that the Take Back the Night rally is happening tonight. It felt like something we wanted to share before we left, and I want to share that it is student-led and student-organized. So the student group is called WOA, which stands for Women Organizing Against Harassment, and they're the ones that have put this event together. So there's a pre-rally on Douglas at 7, and then the march will start at 8, and it will end at Brower Commons by the steps, and that's where a speak out will happen at 9 p.m. That gives the opportunity for anyone to share experiences or talk to the crowd. So we have to step out. We want to
Thank you so much. We are pretty much out of time, so ask a brief question, we'll give you a brief answer, and then we will have a little book sign, okay?
Okay.
For wonderful guests.
I will try. Thank you all again for your conversation and sharing your thoughts with us.
You can.
So my question is about sexuality and feminism. And so earlier when you talked about capitalizing or marketizing feminism, creating shirts that say I'm a feminist, and having high brand shirts that cost 700 pounds saying, be a feminist and that's what you need to be a feminist. So that side of feminism, along with the other side of feminism, or the anti-feminism rhetoric, where they say, I can't respect the feminist movement because of feminists are all ugly, or feminists are all these angry women who don't get respect from men. So, so how should feminism incorporate sexuality? Should it partially incorporate sexuality or being sexy into its movement? Or should it totally reject being sexy as part of its motivations for incorporating it?
That's the last question. Well, incorporating I would say incorporating sexuality and incorporating sexiness are different things. I think that a feminism that is a popular feminism that I would like to see, I'll just phrase it that way, is not one that relies on anyone's bodies for their worth. And so.
Thank you both so much. That was wonderful.
Fireworks, fireworks.
Keeanga and Sarah are both going to be signing their books out there, and their books for sale, and there will be much milling about. And thank you so much for coming.